Thank you. To start, I have to confess I've not quite gotten used to the fact that I'm going to sit and make the presentation. Normally I stand and make presentations, but there's always a first time. So thank you for this invitation. Thank you, Subodh. Thank you, Navya. Thank you, Navya, for, I'm very impressed by how you managed to get all that information. It's so inelegant when people read the introduction, so I'm very impressed. Thank you. So great. So as for most of you may have read, no, this way. Okay. Like the blurb for the presentation read, invariably, Indo-Portuguese. When we hear the word Indo-Portuguese, when it's presented to us, it's actually translated into our heads as Hindu-European, right? Where the Indo stands in for Hindu, and the Portuguese stands in for the European, and where the European translates to Catholic or Christian, right? So the question that, before we get into the Islam in the Indo-Portuguese, the question that needs to be addressed is, how did we get here? Right? I would argue that we get here through something that we're all very familiar with. This is an image taken from that wonderful comic book series that anyone above 40 would actually know. I don't know if you still get this in the market or if it's still accessible. Something called the Amar Chitra Katha series, where the Muslim was clearly presented as the outsider, right? The outsider to India, which is why when you go back to Indo automatically translates into Hindu for most people, because very often all the groundwork had been done by this comic book series. But this comic book series actually benefited from a much longer process. When the British first got here and they needed to start administration of the territories they had acquired, they relied on what scholars would call native informants. And the native informants invariably tended to be, in the Bengal context, from the Sanskritized upper classes, right? Brahmins, and they would make the argument, of course, that they'd make the argument of Brahmanism as being central. Then Brahmanism comes to stand in for the variety, the diverse practices, religious practices that you have in the subcontinent. Now, some people would argue that Hinduism is an invention from the 19th century, right? And I would go with that. There is no Hinduism before the 19th century. The 19th century, when we have these British Orientalists, their native informants who are the upper caste intelligence, they actually produce Hinduism. Prior to that, you just have the religious practices of diverse castes, and these castes may share similar languages, but they don't necessarily see each other as having the same religion, as it were, right? Also, we have to credit our European friends, because our European friends themselves, especially via the Romantic period, were interested in origins. Origin became very important since this period, so while they could identify Islam with the Middle East, India had to also have its own kind of native religion, and Hinduism came to be produced to fill in for this. So this is one more example of when Radhakrishnan speaks about Indian philosophy, what he's actually doing is speaking about Brahmanical philosophy. He's not speaking about the various other kinds of philosophical practices we have in the subcontinent. So what happens as a result of all of this is even the so-called secular nationalists or the secular historians, what they very often do when anthropologists, sociologists, invariably when you talk about India's syncretic culture, invariably it is what is the influence of Hinduism on the religions that came from the outside, Christianity or Islam. no one is asking the question, how did Christianity influence the local practices? How did Christianity influence? How did Islam influence? And so I read this book, which I recommend everyone to read, by Jakia Sayag, which is at the Confluence of Two Rivers, Muslims and Hindus in South India, where he says in view of the social system marked by so much turmoil, what he's referring to essentially is your caste system, right? Where you don't really see the other person as a human being similar to you. It's either higher than you or lower than you. The lower you get, the less human they are. The higher they get, the more godlike they are. So in a social system marked by so much turmoil, it's impossible to consider Islam as an entity introduced into an alien Hindu universe. I think this is so it's only if you can see a Hinduism as already pre-existing that you can see Islam, Christianity as being alien influences. Well, if you have in a social system where there is a plethora of practices, and given the antiquity of Christianity and Islam, recently I wrote a review for a book that speaks about the history of Christianity in South Asia. And I mean, this man, Siddharth Sarma, has to go back to the very origins of Christianity to speak about Christianity in India, because Christianity in India is just that old. Christianity in South Asia. India was Sarma's word. Anyway. I mean, because India, of course, happens only after 1947. Before 1947, you don't have an India, you just have a subcontinent. Right. So this is the reason why conceptually when we think Indo-Portuguese, we think Hindu-Christian, right? Right. So having dealt with that, we now need to ask, another one of the problems is, why don't we see Islam in the Indo-Portuguese? Is not only because the way we understand the term, it's also because the way in which Islam has been set up for so long. So recently I read this excellent work which I urge everyone to read. Even if it's just a couple of chapters, you must read this book. What is Islam by Shahab Ahmed, who's unfortunately no more. Shahab Ahmed's work is excellent. And he suggests various ways in which we can understand Islam. One of the concepts that he presents to us is what he calls the Balkans to Bengal complex. He suggests that Islam is not merely the Quran, but Islam, so he says the Quran is the text, okay? But he says you also have a pretext and a context, right? So the pretext is all the various works that happened prior to the Quran that get incorporated into Muslim practice. We can take the Shahnama of Firdausi, because when he speaks about the Balkans to Bengal complex, he's actually speaking about the Persian world which is influenced by Islam. And so, Persian, the Ottomans also actually what he's referring to, but they also participate in this great world of Islam, which merges Turkic, Persian and Arabic into one kind of, like, for those of you who are familiar with writing about Urdu, where they say to speak good Urdu you need to have a good command of Arabic as well as Persian and know some Turkic as well. So this is the Balkans to Bengal complex. So there's a pretext. Yeah, sure.
Come forward so that you can at least understanding for 1 hour. So the interns can just come.
Right, and so pretext, text, and then a context, and which is like the way in which Islam is lived out in daily practice, and I'll come to that in just a point. But while Shahab Ahmed is speaking about the Balkans to Bengal complex, I think for my argument, I would like to extend the scale a little bit. So what we have here is an image of the Alhambra, which, as you know, was the palace complex of the Nasrid dynasty, which was based in Granada. You can see the Arab palaces on the one hand, and at the back you can also see Charles V's kind of ugly palace. When you go to the Alhambra, you see that everything is so fine, it's like lace, and then you have this huge ugly I'm a great fan of Renaissance and Baroque architecture, but when you compare the two, And if, yeah, you just realize it's such a shocking contrast. So the reason I'm extending the scale is that for us in Goa, while we are also influenced by the Balkans to Bengal complex as a result of the Bahmani and then the Adil Shahi influence on not only the Portuguese in Goa, but in the area prior to Goa emerging, as it were, you had the Arabs in Iberia, and this Arabic culture already influenced the Portuguese who eventually came to South Asia. In fact, there's this quote that I wanted to get, but the person I couldn't locate it in my notes, and the person who promised to send it to me didn't do so. But the text goes basically like this: is that when the sailors came onto the coast of Gujarat, they were reminded of their homes in Iberia, right, or in Andalusia, whatever. These are what we're talking. These are the Portuguese sailors that came to South Asia in the late 1400s and 1500s. The argument being that when these Portuguese sailors went to the east coast of Africa, they couldn't, very often you can pass by something 100 times. It's only after someone points it out to you that you actually recognize it. You can see it. So they went to the coast of East Africa and they couldn't see cities because it was nothing like they had been used to seeing. It's only when they came to the coast of Gujarat that they said, this is something we can see towers, we can see cities, this is a city, right? And so therefore I want to extend the scale to talk about the Arabic influence in Iberia, because this is one of the influences on one of the Islamic influences on the Indo-Portuguese. Why do I now have an image of two wrestlers? Because in his book, Shahab Ahmed's book, the other interesting argument he makes is that who is a Muslim? He says that there's a huge amount of conflict within Muslims on who is a Muslim. For example, in Pakistan, you have Ahmadis and Shias who are being targeted with violence. Very often, the argument against the Ahmadis is that they're not Muslims, and so you have this kind of violence directed against them. But what Ahmed says is that clearly there is no agreement on what is the definitive understanding of Islam. But Muslims by and large know that there is an Islam, and that they differ on certain aspects. But we are all Muslims. He gives a really lovely example in his book. He says that there was this South Asian woman or man and Turkish, if I'm not mistaken. So this couple that met in university in America, and they decided to get married, alhamdulillah. So their fathers had to speak. So now they were a little concerned because one of the fathers was an atheist Muslim, and the other father was a South Asian, and they didn't speak the same language. So, but anyway, the conversation happened. At the end of the conversation, one of these this couple asked the parent, so did everything go well? And the father says, of course it went well. We are both Muslims. Of course we understood each other, right? So there is a thing that Muslims, despite their differences, they agree that there is something known as Islam. And two, he says, and I think this is more important, he gives an example of South Asian, of Punjab. He says that sometimes when Pahalwans, when these wrestlers enter into the Maidan, they call out, Ya Ali, they say, right? He says, when you do that, even though you're not a Muslim, even though you don't officially confess Islam, you are making sense of yourself at that moment through an Islamic formula, through an Islamic context, right? And that in some sense allows you to be Islamic in that particular small moment, right? So in that sense, I think the argument that I'm going to be making today is that in some sense we are all Muslims because of the impact of it, even though we don't recognize it. Very often people, when they talk about the Middle East, They stop at Pakistan. I don't understand how Pakistan enters the Middle East, but never mind. But I would argue that the Muslim world, following the Balkans to Bengal complex idea, extends right up to Bangladesh, right, and includes as a result India within the framework of the Muslim world. The tragedy, however, is that we don't recognize India as part of the Muslim world, and as a result we fail to see things that are actually in front of our very eyes. One of the other things I want to do today is to also suggest that we are all Portuguese, right? Those of us who live in Goa and who are Goan, and these are two different contexts, but we are all Portuguese because, similar to this argument, if we are all Muslim because of the ways in which we often interpret ourselves, similarly we are all Portuguese because, see, I mean, very often in Goa we have this, at least in some groups of us, we look at each other meaningfully and say, oh, he's Portuguese speaking. He or she is Portuguese speaking, which is to say they belong. And invariably this is a reference to a class and caste marker. And you exclude various populations who are native to Goa as not being Portuguese, and some people will say, oh, we are not Portuguese, we have nothing to do. But as I will go on to show, we are all Portuguese. What makes us Portuguese is the fact that we were citizens of Portugal since the beginning, right? And as that term kept getting extended, and we all have some connection with the Portuguese state in Goa, and that makes us indubitably Portuguese. Now, this is an image that I took in a cathedral in Toledo. This is an image of a Catholic saint, Saint Christopher, who some of you will know is the patron saint of travelers, because this guy Ofero used to put people on his back and help them ford the river. One evening, as there's a storm brewing, this little child comes and he says, oh, you know what, Ofero, I need to cross the river and I need to do it now. Ofero can't refuse. He puts the child on his back, crosses the river, and as he crosses the river, he feels the weight of the world on his shoulders. He gets to the other side, and as usual, Christ reveals himself. He says, ha, today you have carried the Christ on your shoulders. You have offered yourself to Christ. Hence, you will no longer be Ofero, but Cristofero. And this is the way they depict Christopher in Toledo. As you can see, he has this kind of medieval tunic. This is another image of Christopher, and for those of you who are observant, you'll notice that this image comes from the cathedral in Old Goa. What is interesting about, this is me who's taken the image, it's a very bad image. But if you look closely, you'll see a line over here, and you can see this little knot over here. So in this image, backtrack. Most people, when they talk about the Indo-Portuguese, they say, aha, look over here, Christopher is wearing a dhoti. Clearly, the artist must have been a Hindu, and therefore he is wearing Hindu clothes. Fine, if that's the way you want to interpret it. But then I say, look at the shirt he's wearing, which is in fact an angarkha. Now, if dhotis belong to Hindus, which it doesn't, but that's another story, then the angarkha comes into South Asia via the Persians, right? Or via the Persianized groups that come into South Asia. This is an image from something called the Codex Casanatensi, right? It's now in the Vatican Library. And the Codex Casanatensi was an album describing the Portuguese world, or the world that the Portuguese discovered in the Indian Ocean. And this scene is depicted a Canary wedding. Now, for those of you who know, the Canary is us, right? Actually, the upper castes in the area. So it depicts what we could assume could be a Brahmanical wedding, right? And you have these women who we can clearly see are wearing saris. If you note, I don't think these women are actually wearing blouses, but that's another story. We'll come to that later. And you have this gentleman over here who's clearly the groom, but the groom is also wearing a jama, right? So already in this, let's say, early contact, and one assumes that they were already dressing like this, you have Hindus or non-Muslims, as one should ideally put it, or Brahmanized caste, members of Brahmanized caste, dressing like Persian princes or Turkic princes, right? My argument then being that the Indo-Portuguese art may be produced by local artisans, but these are not simply Hindu artisans. These are in fact persons who are immersed in an Islamic culture, right? This is another image of Vijayanagara princes, and once again you see that they are wearing these kinds of jamas. There is this really interesting text. Good grief, I've forgotten the, but you look it up online. The title of the text is Sultan Among Hindu Princes, Hindu Raya Surat Rana. Surat Rana actually is a corruption of Sultan, right? So the Vijayanagara princes, now we often, traditional historiography will tell us Vijayanagara was the Hindu bastion against Muslim aggression. That's all poppycock. Because your Vijayanagara princes themselves are using Turkic term, Sultan, to talk about their preeminence among non-Turkic princes, right? And they themselves are wearing Islamic garments. And in this text, Sultan Among Hindu Princes, the author, what was his name? Never mind, it'll come back to me. Say?
Harihara.
No, Wagner, something Wagner, right? He talks about this cap being in fact an Arabic cap, right? So you have your supposedly Hindu princes actually immersed completely in an Islamic dress and Islamic titles, right? I'll take questions later. Yeah. We'll come to that later in discussion period. I'm trying to run through this so that we have time for discussion. And this is an image of Goan Dhangas dancing in a ceremony organized under the Estado Novo. You can see the Portuguese flag up here, or the Portuguese symbol. And these Dhangas, who we today call tribals, are also wearing jamas, right? And even today when they dance, they wear these jamas. Once again, there is clearly an Islamic heritage to these people. Yeah, and when I say these people, I'm not using it in the term of these people that we normally use. I'm saying the people in a kind of a sociological sense. The Jama has a longer history in Goa. I came to Goa without my laptop. I thought I'd use my mother's laptop. My mother's laptop has its own problems. So I haven't been able to get to my notes. But this is a gentleman, he's quite famous. Wendell Rodrigues has made reference to him. Apparently this is a gentleman, and it was a group of Goan intellectuals in the late 19th century who wanted to articulate a Goan dress and make a distinction between themselves and the metropolitan Portuguese and claim a Goan identity. And then so he evolved this kind of gown, and this gentleman requested that he be buried in the gown as well. Actually, is there any Monteiro over here? No. This gentleman is a relative of the Monteiros, one of whom who runs, but anyway, irrelevant. So this gown is in fact a descendant of the Jama. It was called a kabia, right? And this was the dress of the Goan Bhatkas at home when they didn't have to dress in European formal wear. And the kabia is also the name that was given to the Turkic dress that the Vijayanagara sultans were wearing, right? So the kabia is impressed on Goan society and comes into, so contrary to what Rodrigues argues, I would argue that this garment wasn't invented by this gentleman. He was building on an older tradition that already existed in Goan upper caste society, right? The other argument that people often make is about this dress, which is called the panbaju, which is what women in Salsette, upper class women in Salsette would wear, especially to what would be called balls, right? Very often people say, oh yes, this dress comes from the Far East because it's like a sarong, and I don't argue that there is no Far Eastern influence on this dress, but let us remember that places like Malaysia are part of the Islamic world, right? Before the Portuguese got into the Indian Ocean, the Arabs were all over the place and linking the Indian Ocean through trade networks. Even today you have a really strong network of Hadramis, Arabs from Yemen, who are these kind of privileged status groups all over Southeast Asia. So I wouldn't argue that there is a later influence on this dress, but I'm saying that because of the bias we have against Islam, or either against in the sense of we don't like it, or that we don't see it, we don't look to places closer afield. So have a look at this. These are Mapla women from the Malabar. And look at the dress they're wearing. They're wearing a bodice, they are wearing a skirt, which is not very different from this garment. I mean, remove all the embroidery and such like, and you see it's pretty similar. What the Christian and Islamic cultures have in common is a notion of modesty, right? That I'm not privileging modesty over here. I'm saying that this is the notion that they have, that the body should be covered and you should not show it to other people. Wherein that argument I made, that reference I made earlier about the absence of the choli. Those of you who know will know that when the Portuguese came in, they obliged women to wear a bodice. And very often our Bengali friends will argue that the bodice was invented in Victorian times in Bengal. This is what Bengalis do all the time. But clearly there is an earlier history of the bodice emerging into South Asia via Islam, via Christianity under the Portuguese. Once again, you have bodice, you have the sarong and a head covering. So my argument is that these areas, before the Portuguese constitute Goa doesn't exist before the Portuguese come, right? This is all part of a one west coast, all linked together by trade, and they're all in conversation with each other. It is but natural. And remember that the Portuguese first land in South Asia in Malabar, right? They do see Muslims. It is, and no matter how much they may dislike Muslims, it is not too much of a stretch to imagine that they would see certain kinds of similarities and patterns, and therefore recommend it for converts to Christianity as well. This is another garment. This is an image from a collection of images depicting Goans, yeah, under Portuguese sovereignty. This is a Catholic woman who's going off to mass, and she is wearing what is known as vole. Do I hear? Okay, vole. The vole was not worn by all women. It was worn essentially by upper caste women, if not only Brahmin women. But I'm just trying to contextualize it in caste and class, not trying to make exclusive argument here. So this is what they wear, and what I found really interesting is how similar it is to the chador, right? In terms, I mean, just look at the way this woman is holding it over here, and to the way the woman holds the chador over here. Once again, remember that the Adil Shahi court was a Shia court to a large extent. There's a strong Shia culture in the Bahmani Sultanate, and we shouldn't be surprised if there are these kinds of longer connections. But in any case, I just want to point out that whether in Malabar or via the Deccan, Goa is profoundly influenced by Islam. It's an Islamic context within which it is operating. Most people would see this as the definition of Hinduism in Goa. I mean, we say that, only in Goa do we have these wonderful lamps. It's peculiarly Goan, blah, blah, blah. And it is true. I mean, for a long time, I also held this really fond assumption about Goan culture, until I saw this image from the Patna school depicting, if I'm not mistaken, late 18th century, a Muharram ceremony over here, and all of a sudden, all your assumptions about the uniqueness of Goan culture just like evaporate into thin air. I once showed this to a North Indian scholar from this from the Lucknow area. I forget his name, and he said, "Ha, this is Akash Kandil," he says. Oh no, he says this is Kandil. This is Kandil. So once again, this goes out to all our notion about the uniqueness of in Goan culture goes out to the through the window. Because clearly you see it in operation in, once again, in Islamic context, once again in a Shia context. And I mean, for me, as I've been exploring these ideas, what emerges really strongly is how profoundly Shia most of our Islamic connections are. The reason I put this image up here is that if there is the Kandil probably comes to Goa via our Maratha friends who at some point are making contact with the Mughals up in the north, and if not actually sustaining the Mughal empire by keeping the Mughal emperor as a puppet. And this image is to show that how tightly immersed in Islamic culture the Marathas were. This is an image of Shivaji. Like this is like the portrait par excellence of Shivaji. Once again, you can see he's wearing a jama, right? And this is the last, this guy here is the last Adil Shahi ruler of Bijapur. So, and of course, Shivaji was a feudatory or a vassal to the Adil Shah before he becomes a nuisance to the Mughals, right? So, what is clear is that Shivaji himself is operating in an Islamic context. Even his father's name Shahji is Shah, right, which already gives us an insight into the kind of Islamic culture that they were living in. There's this other book that I really recommend people read. It's called Islamic Traditions, India's Islamic Traditions by Richard Eaton, which also talks about how it is possible for someone to continue doing their native practices, let's say non-Muslim practices, and participate in Islam, very much Islam, because it's only after the census emerges that people then feel obliged to say that they are Muslim or they are Hindu, right? And this is also the moment that Hindu nationalism starts emerging as the castes that produce Hinduness try to consolidate a Hindu majority in the subcontinent to kind of take over power from the British. Now, so you've noticed so far I have moved away from what most people would argue is Indo-Portuguese. When people talk about Indo-Portuguese culture, the first thing that comes to their head is architecture and such like. I wanted to keep that for the latter part because I want to show that even where we are not looking, there is an Islamic impress. Now, this is a panel from either the the Archbishop's Palace in Old Goa or the Capella do Monte once again in Old Goa. All these buildings have this sgraffito work, and there is this tendency within Goa to suggest that this is not sgraffito, but it's actually a vernacular tradition called kavi. There are a variety of arguments that are proposed. They say, oh yes, but the technique is slightly different from sgraffito, and which once again I think is they're trying to make the argument too hard, because once again the effort is always to show, oh no, we had culture before the Portuguese came, Goa existed before the Portuguese came, but I really don't buy those arguments. So anyway, sgraffito here, and this is not sgraffito. This is a decoration at the bottom of the stairs leading to the pulpit in São Caetano or Saint Cajetan in Old Goa. The argument I want to make, once again, sgraffito, the argument I want to make is that this red and white combination is peculiar to the Andalusian architecture. This is Cordoba, right? The great mosque at Cordoba. This white and red combination, you have it also, you see it under the one of the sultans of the Sultan dynasties of Delhi, right? You see it in the 13th century layer of Lisbon. I have a photograph, but I couldn't locate it. But you just have to take my word for it or visit me in Lisbon and I'll show you. So when you have already this kind of combination in 13th, 11th century Iberia, you find the same combination in Goa under the Portuguese. And the technique is European. I think it's really difficult to continue sustaining the argument that, Kavi is a local tradition. Heta Pandit makes the argument, which I think is slightly embarrassing, in a line in her earlier works. I'm not saying her argument may have developed substantially since then. The argument is that since this Kavi work is present in temples, and of course temples pre-exist Christianity in India, of course the Kavi was taken from the temples into the churches, and this is like a very basic argument, because these temples could be, this is also the assumption that we have in our heads, that Hindu is equal to India, India is equal to Hindu, Hindu is always pre-existing, is the older. Also this Orientalist idea that Hinduism never changed, right? And as I'll go on, we'll also see how Hinduism, or what we see as Hinduism today, also profoundly changes. I'm not denying that these are all Brahmanical deities, but the suggestion would be that these are all taken via, it could be that the artisans are also native, but they are clearly learning techniques and combinations via the Portuguese, who themselves are inheritors of a longer Arabic Islamic tradition, right? This now is a tombstone in the Nossa Senhora do Rosário in Old Goa, Lady of the Rosary. So you see this dedication, which is classically, let's say, Portuguese. You have a pediment and you have pillars on each side. But if you look at the pillars, these pillars actually are very South Asian, right? And then you look at this frieze over here, once again it is South Asian. You would see something similar in the temples in Mount Abu and such like. But then you also look at, so this is a close-up. So clearly you can see the kind of Jaina influences over here. You can see this wheel over here, but then you also see the censer, right? And incense, as we know, is a part of Islamic practice. We use it in the graves of the peers. We use it while at prayer. Use it in mosques. Use it to welcome guests. What needs to be noted is that this tombstone is clearly a use, and you had factories in Surat or in the Surat region that would produce these en masse and then ship it across the Indian Ocean or the Arabian Sea. So you find these in East Africa, you find it in Kerala, and you find it in Goa. So once again, there is an Islamic context to the way in which. So even though, see, the point is, scholarship until date very often is obsessed with origin. So we want to say, so this is Jain. But then we don't see the context in which it is used, and therefore how it is made Islamic, right? And this is exactly Shahab Ahmad's argument, that it is made Islamic even though it may have a past that is pre-Islamic. But recently there was this kind of furor of social media drama about this image of Krishna pointing out to a moon, to a bunch of, how many of you have seen that image? There's just one person, there's, look how wonderful it is, all of that. After having read Shahab Ahmad, I realized that, at the end it was realized this was not Krishna pointing out the moon of Shawwal to Muslims. It was Krishna pointing to Govardhan, to a bunch of his clansmen who are dressed in angarkhas, and so people thought they were Muslim. But the point is that if if Krishna was in fact pointing to the moon, this is a way in which Krishna becomes another person pointing to the truth of Islam, right? So it is not Krishna as the Hindu deity, it is Krishna as a notable figure who is pointing to the only truth, which is that there is one God, So you see that how this challenges the rhetoric of syncretism that very often we've been hearing in India, right? This is another example of the. This is now plasterwork from the Say Cathedral. There is this little door to the left of the cathedral. At the crossing, if you look to the left, the door through which you used to enter if you or leave for the exposition when you come to venerate the relics of St. Francis Xavier. So this is the door, and I chanced upon this. I said, how interesting, right? Because this once again is not out of place whether in Granada or you could say in the plasterwork that you find in the Deccan. In fact, I found the similarity quite striking between this motif and this motif, right? They're very similar. And one wonders if they are representations of a pomegranate or whatever. But the fact is, you have the Blessed Sacrament, which is this object over here, with two candles resting on a altar, which is decorated in within what you would understand as classically Islamic. Very often, this is the bell tower of Our Lady of Miracles, the Church of Saint Jerome in Mapsa, and very often there is these fond arguments that this is a reference to a Hindu temple because there was a temple earlier on this spot. But the sad fact is that there is a longer history to how this tower gets here, and this history probably begins with the facade of the Franciscan Church in Old Goa. You have these hexagonal towers over here. Now, Paulo Varela Gomes wrote this excellent work called Red Stone Whitewash, which is a work I think is fundamental reading for anyone trying to understand Goan architecture, where he argues that what we have in Goa is these are not European churches. These are Goan churches that use European language and other languages to construct a unique argument, right, to assert themselves. So the Franciscans, as the work of Angela Barret Xavier, who is a Portuguese historian of Goan origin, were very often patronized by descendant families, right? Anyway, that's irrelevant to the argument, but so you don't find hexagonal towers in Europe, right? You find it here in Old Goa. And what Varela Gomes argues is that this is where it comes from, right? From the Gol Gumbaz in Bijapur, because Bijapur at the time was like France was. I mean, it was larger than France, and France was like the major power under Louis XIV in Europe. It was the power. So it's obviously when you're making an argument in a local sphere, you are looking to other princes, and monuments are always princely erections. So the tower of Milagres has its ancestor in this. There's a very interesting work being done by Amita Kanekar, who's talking about the uniqueness of the temple in Goa and how it merges elements from Europe, from Bijapur, in once again. So what she's making Paulo Varela's argument for the Goan temple, and she's some person who should definitely be invited to speak here. In terms of lived practices, this is an image taken by my friend Hansel Vaz and shared on Facebook, from where I very wickedly robbed it. This is an image of the Feast of the Three Kings in Kansalni. And you have this lady here who is going under the horse which carries one of the kings. In this image, this is from Goa Valia. You have a palanquin carrying a saint, and you see these people going under the palanquin. Now, this is once again very interestingly, this is a practice that you see that is reported in Muharram practices as well. These are images from the commemoration of Muharram. This is Duldul, who was the horse of Imam Hussein. This is, I have no idea what this is. This is what they call a, oh Jesus, say?
It's a taboo.
There is another word I'm looking for. But a tabu, this is a replica of the grave of the Imam. Say? No. This is just the various kinds of these taboos are made. There is more anyway. And then this is an alam, right? Which is once again the banners that would have been carried into the Battle of Karbala. And so these are replicas. And then you have these panjas. You have a panja here, panja being 5 in Persian, panj. And you have a panja here, which represent the family of Fatima. So you have references to people going under these taboos to get the blessings of the imams, right? And so and this is something you see in Goa as well, except in quite a Catholic context, which I found amazing. This is a procession, a Shia procession in Daman, if I'm not mistaken, Daman or Diu, which I got from this wonderful page called Memorias de Indo-Portuguese. As Memórias de Indo-Portuguese, or the Memories of Portuguese India, which collects all these images from various times of Portuguese India. This is an image of Yalama, which I found in a museum in Lisbon. And once again, I mean, what I found interesting is that once again you have these panja-like figures, and if you look at certain temple processions, you also have these palms over poles in temple processions, right? Very much like alams, except that what I've noticed the difference that these hands have longer nails. So I don't know, no one's been able to explain this to me as yet. As of now, I just like to say that look how interesting the similarity. But the story of Yalama is interesting because there was this Dhangar myth that I read from the Kolhapur region, where now most of us know the Yalama story. Well, Yalama, I should also point out, apparently there was this goddess Yalama, which gives her name to the city of Ella, which then becomes the city of Old Goa. So Yalama is clearly a goddess in Goa as well, or in the region that becomes Goa as well. Normally the story of Yalama is linked with Parashurama. Now we all know the story of Parashurama in Goa. So according to this story, Parashurama's mother was Renuka. Renuka was a chaste woman at one point in time, and because of this she had certain powers. When her husband, the sage Jamadagni, realized that she didn't have these powers anymore, he suspected that she wasn't chaste anymore. He ordered his sons to kill her. Now all the sons refused, only Parashuram agreed. He went running after her to kill her. She took refuge with this lower caste woman, and Parashuram kills them both. Then Parashuram, being the devoted son to his mother, asks his father for a boon. Father is pleased. He says, okay, now revive my mother, give these women back their lives. The father says, okay. In his haste, he exchanges the heads, right? And so you have upper caste woman with lower caste body, lower caste head with upper caste body. So you have Renuka and Yalama as a result. Yalama is the person, I think, with the lower caste head. Oh, say? But anyway, so this is Yalama. This is one myth of Yalama. The other myth of Yalama that I read via these Dhangars is that Yalama belongs to a group of 7 sisters. This should already be familiar to us in Goa. And when they all go hunting, she gets separated from her sisters. She eats chickpeas from a temple which is dedicated to Shiva. She's warned not to do so. She does it anyways because she's really stubborn. And she gets a blister on her hand. At some point she pierces the blister. She finds a child in it. She eventually meets her sisters. The sisters say, who is this child with you? You've had a child outside of wedlock. Go away from us. We don't want you with us anymore. Poor thing is all alone. She finds these 2 brothers. She finds refuge with these 2 brothers called Asan and Usan, which is a corruption of Hassan and Hussein, are two Shia heroes who in the Deccan are seen as the protectors of children, widows, women, and such like. So it's only natural that she finds them. They give her, they help her, they tell her to go meet their father. Their father is Jagul Satyava, the truth of the earth, which as we know is Allah. So they all come to this house. Parshuram and Yalama eat in the same line as these Muslim boys, and they tell, listen, we are Muslims, you lose caste. She says it's no problem. Then and at the end of the day, they all eat, and she revives the goats that were used to make the food that they all ate, and such like. So once again you have Yalama in quite an Islamic context, and this I'm getting this cult of Yalama in the Deccan. In some places they offer her these silver horses, which are depicted, as you can see, as duldulis. So once again you have this connection with Hassan and Hussain. I just wanted to end with the reference to how Muharram was this really important festival. You've all read this. There are like Muslims and Hindus participating in, not Hindus but non-Muslims participating in this. And it is only, and this is like a procession of Muharram in Bombay. And this is, and you would immerse the tazia. It's not tabu, this is the tazia. Tazia is what the word I was looking for. The tazias would then be immersed into the river. Now, if this image looks familiar, immersion sounds familiar, is because the festival of Ganesh Chaturthi that we celebrate today, the public festival, I'm not talking about the private the household festivals. The private festivals are modeled on Muharram, in fact were invented by Tilak to ensure that Muharram is not the preeminent festival, but in fact you have something that allows people to distinguish themselves from Muslims and produce themselves as Hindus, right? So this is the thing I end with. We have a couple of minutes, I think, for a discussion.
Questions,
yes. So I'm happy to take questions now.
I will just make one observation. Sure. I mean, even the patron saint of Goa has an Islamic name. It's also Sahib.
Right, yeah, very good.
And Mother Mary is Sahibin, Mrs. Sahib. So, and then one of the most common pronunciations here in Goa, in Konkani, is Sahiba Bugus.
Right.
Again, Arabic.
In fact, I'm glad you brought this up, Subodh, because in fact, something I didn't have the time to put the image in. You see the staff, very often St. Francis Xavier is depicted holding a long staff. Now, this staff has nothing to do with his priestly ministry, right? It has everything to do with the office of the Viceroy or the Governor General. And that itself has an Islamic context, because the Marathas were attacking Old Goa, were at the gates of Old Goa, and all was lost. So the Governor General has no other option but to have recourse to the spiritual, and he places a staff of office in the hands of St. Francis Xavier, and he says, take care of the city because I can't now. And as if miraculously, the Mughals attack on another front, and so the Maratha camp is all wound up and the Marathas go away. So in some sense, there is an Islamic context to the fact that St. Francis Xavier has his staff, because subsequently every Governor General would get his staff of office from the saint, and at the end of office return it to the saint. And this practice then once again emerges in the fact that you have the Mughals who are attacking the Marathas. So there is definitely an Islamic context to that. Some of you might think that I'm stressing the Islamic context a little too much. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. But if I am, I think it's important at this point of time to make that overemphasis, because it allows us to correct the imbalance that is happening. When the scale tilts too much in one side, you need to go to the other to kind of tilt it a little bit. Honestly, I don't think I'm doing too much of an exaggeration. I'm not doing an exaggeration. I think it's a fairly respectable interpretation. But some more questions, if any.